My name is Margaret, and I'm 32 years old. 3 days ago on my birthday morning, I received a package that changed everything I thought I knew about safety trust and the people who claim to love us. The beautiful wrapped box sitting on my doorstep looked like an answer to prayers I'd been whispering for 3 long years. My parents, Robert and Dorothy, had cut all contact when I married Frank, and this gorgeous package seemed like their way of reaching out, of saying they were ready to forgive and forget. But when my husband Frank saw that box, his face went white as snow, and he grabbed my arm with a desperation I'd never seen before. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from today, and please hit that like button and subscribe, because this story is going to take you on quite the journey that will make you question everything you think you know about the people closest to you. Growing up in small-town Marietta, Ohio, I always knew my parents were protective, but I didn't realize how controlling they really were until I started dating in high school. Robert worked at the local bank for 37 years, and Dorothy taught second grade at the elementary school where half the town sent their children. They had opinions about everything, especially about the boys I brought home. Every boyfriend was either too poor, too wild, or from the wrong family. When Tommy Peterson asked me to junior prom, they spent 2 hours explaining why his father's drinking problem made him unsuitable. When I dated Jake Morrison's senior year, they researched his family's financial troubles and presented me with a folder of evidence about why he was clearly after our money. I met Frank during my sophomore year at Ohio State University in Professor Williams' American Literature class. He was this quiet guy from Youngstown who worked 3 jobs to pay for school. His father was a steelworker, his mother cleaned houses, and Frank himself worked nights at a diner, weekends at a hardware store, and somehow still managed to maintain a perfect grade point average in education. While other guys my age were partying and spending their parents' money, Frank was reading Steinbeck between shifts and saving every penny to avoid student loans. The first time I brought Frank home for Thanksgiving, I watched my parents' faces fall the moment he walked through the door. Dorothy's smile became strained when Frank mentioned his father worked with his hands, and Robert's handshake lingered too long, like he was trying to intimidate this young man who'd captured his daughter's heart. Over dinner, they peppered Frank with questions designed to highlight the differences between our backgrounds. When Frank mentioned he'd never been on a family vacation because his parents couldn't afford it, Dorothy made a point of describing our annual trips to Mackinac Island in excruciating detail. But Frank handled it all with grace that impressed me more than any expensive gift ever could. He asked thoughtful questions about Robert's work at the bank, complimented Dorothy's cooking genuinely, and even helped wash dishes without being asked. When my parents criticized his major in education, saying teachers didn't make enough money to support a family properly, Frank simply smiled and said he'd rather do work that mattered than work that just paid well. I fell deeper in love with him that weekend, even as I watched my parents' disapproval grow with every passing hour. After graduation, Frank and I moved to Denver together. He got a job teaching 5th grade at an inner-city school, and I found work at a suburban elementary school. We rented a tiny apartment near downtown, furnished it with secondhand finds and plants we grew from seeds. Every evening we'd sit on our small balcony sharing stories from our classrooms and planning our future together. Frank would tell me about students who reminded him of himself growing up, kids whose parents worked multiple jobs and struggled to make ends meet. I'd share funny moments from my younger students, like the day little Sarah insisted that clouds were actually sheep that had learned to fly. When Frank proposed during a hike in Rocky Mountain National Park, I said yes before he'd even finished asking the question. The ring was modest, a simple solitaire he'd saved for 8 months to buy, but it meant more to me than any expensive jewelry my parents had ever given me. We called my parents that evening to share the news, expecting congratulations, but the conversation went cold the moment I mentioned Frank's name. Dorothy's voice became clipped and formal, and Robert barely spoke at all. They asked when we were planning to have the wedding, and when I said we were thinking about a small ceremony in Denver with just close friends and family, Dorothy said they'd have to think about whether they could attend. The months leading up to our wedding were a constant source of stress as my parents found excuse after excuse to avoid participating. They couldn't come to taste wedding cakes because Dorothy had a book club meeting. They couldn't help with planning because they were too busy with Robert's retirement preparations. When I sent them invitation samples, they criticized every choice. The font was too casual, the venue too informal, the whole event too small and unimpressive for their daughter's wedding. Frank watched me cry after each difficult phone call and suggested maybe we should elope, but I still held hope that they'd come around when they saw how happy Frank made me. 2 weeks before the wedding, Dorothy called to tell me they wouldn't be attending. She said they couldn't support a marriage they believed was a mistake, that I was too young to understand, I was settling for less than I deserved. When I asked what Frank had ever done to make them dislike him so much, she couldn't give me a real answer beyond vague concerns about our different backgrounds. That phone call was the last time I spoke to either of my parents. Frank and I had a beautiful small wedding with his family, our college friends, and a few co-workers. His mother Mary welcomed me with open arms and told me she'd never seen her son happier. Frank's father Jim walked me down the aisle when my own father refused to come. After the ceremony, Mary pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. Honey, family isn't just about blood. It's about people who show up for you when it matters most. For 3 years, I'd heard nothing from Robert and Dorothy. No birthday cards, no Christmas calls, no acknowledgement that I even existed. Frank never said, "I told you so," but he'd hold me when I cried on holidays, wondering if my parents ever thought about me. He'd listen when I worried that maybe they were right, that maybe I had settled for less than I deserved. And every time he'd remind me gently that love isn't about money or status, it's about partnership, respect, and choosing each other every single day. Now Frank and I were living in a cozy house in the suburbs, both still teaching, talking about starting a family of our own. We'd created a life filled with Sunday morning pancakes, evening walks through our neighborhood, and Friday night movie marathons on our secondhand couch. Frank had been promoted to department head at his school, and I'd started a reading program for struggling students at mine. We had friends who felt like family hobbies we enjoyed together and dreams for the future that excited us both. So when that beautiful package appeared on our doorstep on my 32nd birthday, wrapped in elegant silver paper with a white silk ribbon, my heart started racing with possibility. The return address was my childhood home in Marietta, written in what looked like my mother's careful handwriting. For a moment, I let myself imagine that 3 years of silence had finally ended, that my parents had realized what they'd lost and wanted me back in their lives. I carried the package inside with trembling hands, setting it carefully on our kitchen table. The box was about the size of a shoebox, but surprisingly light, almost as if it were empty. The silver wrapping paper was expensive, the kind Dorothy always insisted on using for special occasions, and the white ribbon was tied in the perfect bow she'd taught me to make when I was 8 years old. Every detail seemed exactly like something my mother would choose, from the classic color scheme to the handwritten label that said, "Happy Birthday, Margaret," in her familiar script. Frank was getting ready for work when I called him into the kitchen, practically bouncing with excitement. "Look what came," I said, pointing to the package. "It's from my parents. They remembered my birthday." For a moment, I let myself feel that rush of hope I'd been suppressing for 3 years. Maybe they'd realized how much they missed me. Maybe they wanted to meet their son-in-law properly and be part of our lives again. But Frank's reaction wasn't what I expected. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the package, his coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips. His face went pale and he set the mug down with shaking hands. "Margaret," he said slowly, "don't touch that box." I laughed, thinking he was being overly cautious. "Frank, it's just a birthday present from my parents. I know you don't trust them, but they're not going to send me anything dangerous." I reached for the ribbon, but Frank grabbed my wrist gently but firmly. "No, seriously," he said, his voice tight with anxiety. "There's something wrong with that package. Don't open it." He walked around the table, studying the box from different angles, his brow furrowed with concentration. "What are you talking about?" I asked, getting frustrated. "It's a perfectly normal birthday present. You're being paranoid." I couldn't understand why Frank was acting so strangely. This was supposed to be a happy moment, a sign that my family might finally be ready to accept him and welcome me back. Frank continued to stare at the package, and I could see genuine fear in his eyes. "Margaret, I'm serious. Something is very wrong here. Can't you see it?" He pointed at the box, but I had no idea what he was seeing that I wasn't. I looked more closely at the package, but everything seemed normal to me. The paper was smooth and unwrinkled, the ribbon was tied perfectly, and the handwriting on the label looked exactly like my mother's. "Frank, you're scaring me. What do you think you see?" But Frank just shook his head, backing away from the table. "Promise me you won't open that while I'm at work. Please, Margaret. Just promise me you'll wait until I get home." His hands were actually shaking now, and I'd never seen him so agitated about anything. Part of me wanted to ignore his concerns and open the present right then, but something in Frank's voice made me pause. In 5 years together, I'd never seen him react to anything with this level of fear. "Okay," I said reluctantly. "I'll wait. But you have to explain to me what you think you're seeing, because I honestly don't understand." Frank kissed my forehead, but I could feel the tension in his body. "I will. When I get home, we'll figure this out together. Just please don't touch that box while I'm gone." After Frank left for work, I found myself circling that package like a moth drawn to flame. Every few minutes I'd walk into the kitchen and stare at it, trying to see whatever had frightened my husband so much. I picked up the phone 3 times to call Dorothy, wanting to thank her for remembering my birthday, but each time I hesitated. What if Frank was right to be suspicious? What if there was something I was missing? Around noon, I decided to examine the package more carefully. I got a magnifying glass from Frank's desk and studied every inch of the wrapping paper, looking for any sign of tampering or damage. The postmark showed it had been mailed 2 weeks ago from Marietta, which seemed odd. Why would my parents mail a birthday present so early when they could have timed it to arrive exactly on my birthday? The longer I stared at that box, the more questions began forming in my mind. How did my parents know our current address, when we'd moved twice since the wedding? Why was the package so light when it looked substantial enough to contain something meaningful? And why did Frank, who'd never been paranoid about anything in his life, react with such immediate and intense fear? By the time Frank came home from work, I was sitting at the kitchen table, still staring at the unopened package. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told him. "And I think you might be right that something's not quite right here. But I still don't know what you're seeing that I'm not." Frank sat down across from me, his expression grave. "Margaret, I need to tell you something I've been keeping from you, and I should have told you weeks ago." Frank reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder I'd never seen before. "For the past month I've been getting these at school," he said, opening the folder to reveal several sheets of paper. "I didn't want to worry you, especially with everything going well in our lives, but I think they might be connected to this package." He handed me the first letter, and my stomach dropped as I read it. The message was printed on plain white paper. "She doesn't deserve happiness. She made her choice. Now she'll face the consequences." There was no signature, no return address, just those chilling words that made my blood run cold. "Frank, why didn't you tell me about this?" I whispered, looking through the other letters. Each one was more disturbing than the last, mentioning details about our daily routines that only someone watching us closely would know. One letter described what I'd worn to work 3 days earlier. Another mentioned the grocery store where we shopped and the time we usually went. A third referenced our weekend walks through the neighborhood and the route we typically took. "I thought it was just some random crazy person," Frank said, running his hands through his hair. "I figured if I ignored it, they'd get bored and move on. But when I saw that package today, something clicked. The handwriting on the birthday label, it's similar to these letters, but it's trying to look like someone else's writing." I studied my mother's supposed handwriting on the package label more carefully, comparing it to the threatening letters. Frank was right. There were subtle differences I hadn't noticed before. The loops on the letters were slightly different, and the pressure of the pen wasn't consistent with Dorothy's usual careful script. "There's more," Frank continued, his voice heavy with regret. "Last week, Mrs. Henderson next door mentioned she'd seen someone parked across the street from our house several evenings, just sitting in their car. And remember how you said you felt like someone was following you at the grocery store last month? I don't think you were imagining it. My mind was racing trying to process this information. But who would do this? And why would they pretend the package is from my parents? Even as I asked the question, a terrible possibility was beginning to form in my mind. Frank leaned forward, his expression serious. Margaret, I think someone has been watching us, learning about our lives, and they know about your estrangement from your parents. They're using that against you, trying to manipulate your emotions by pretending to be the family you've been hoping to hear from. I felt sick to my stomach. The idea that someone had been observing our private lives, taking notes on our routines, and now using my deepest emotional wound as a weapon was almost too horrifying to comprehend. But the package looks so real, I said weakly. The wrapping, the handwriting, everything looks just like something my mother would send. That's what makes it so sinister, Frank replied. Whoever did this has been studying you long enough to know exactly how to replicate your mother's style. They know you well enough to create something that would fool you completely. I looked at the package again, and suddenly I could see what Frank had noticed immediately. There was something too perfect about it, too calculated. The wrapping was exactly what I would expect from Dorothy, but it was almost like a caricature of her style, an exaggerated version that hit all the right notes, but lacked the subtle imperfections of real human behavior. Frank, what do you think is in it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, he admitted, but I noticed something when I first saw it this morning. If you look very carefully at the wrapping paper, there are tiny holes, almost invisible unless you know what to look for. And every few minutes the box moves slightly, just a millimeter or two. I stared at the package with new eyes, and after a few moments of careful observation, I saw it too. The slightest movement so subtle I dismissed it as my imagination or air currents in the room. But it was there, a rhythmic shifting that suggested something alive inside the box. Oh my God, I breathed, pushing my chair back from the table. Frank, what if there's something dangerous in there? What if it's designed to hurt me when I open it? That's exactly what I'm afraid of, Frank said grimly. This isn't just a prank or a mean joke. Someone has gone to elaborate lengths to create something that would psychologically devastate you, using your relationship with your parents as bait. And the fact that there's something alive in there makes it even more disturbing. I felt violated in a way I'd never experienced before. Someone had been watching me, studying my habits, learning about my family relationships, and crafting this cruel manipulation specifically to hurt me in the deepest way possible. The package that had filled me with hope just hours earlier now seemed like a weapon designed to destroy my emotional well-being. We need to call the police, I said, but even as I said it, I hesitated. What would I tell them? That my husband thought there was something wrong with a birthday present? That we suspected someone was impersonating my estranged parents? It sounded paranoid even to me. Frank seemed to read my thoughts. I know it sounds crazy, but let's at least drive to Marietta and check on your parents first. If they really sent this package, we'll know we're being paranoid. But if they didn't, the drive to Marietta would take 3 hours, and it was already late afternoon, but I knew Frank was right. We needed to know for certain whether my parents had sent this package before we involved the authorities. I called in sick for the next day, and Frank arranged for a substitute teacher. We left the package exactly where it was and drove through the night to my hometown. The familiar streets of Marietta looked different in the pre-dawn darkness, smaller and shabbier than I remembered from my childhood. Frank drove slowly through the quiet neighborhoods, while I navigated from memory, my heart pounding with anticipation and dread. What would we find when we reached my parents' house? Part of me still hoped this was all a misunderstanding, that Robert and Dorothy really had decided to reach out after 3 years of silence. When we turned onto Elm Street, where I'd grown up, I immediately noticed something was wrong. The house at 412 Elm, the 2-story colonial where I'd spent 18 years of my life, looked abandoned. The lawn was overgrown, newspapers were scattered across the front porch, and several windows were boarded up with plywood. The cheerful yellow paint my mother had chosen 5 years ago was peeling and faded, and the garden she'd tended so carefully was choked with weeds. "Margaret," Frank said softly, "this doesn't look like anyone's lived here for months." I felt my stomach drop as we parked across the street and stared at what had once been my childhood home. "Maybe they're just traveling," I said desperately, but even I didn't believe it. Dorothy would never let her garden deteriorate like this, and Robert was too proud of his property to allow newspapers to pile up on the porch. We walked up to the front door and I knocked hesitantly, knowing there would be no answer. The silence was deafening. Frank tried peering through the windows that weren't boarded up, but all he could see were empty rooms with sheets covering the furniture. "Let's ask the neighbors," Frank suggested, and we walked to the house next door where Mrs. Patterson had lived for as long as I could remember. She was the neighborhood gossip who knew everyone's business, and if anyone would know what had happened to my parents, it would be her. Mrs. Patterson answered the door in her bathrobe, squinting at us in the early morning light. It took her a moment to recognize me, but when she did, her face went pale. "Margaret, oh honey, what are you doing here? I thought you knew." "Knew what?" I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. Mrs. Patterson invited us inside and made coffee with shaking hands while she tried to find the right words. "Sweetie, your parents. They died 8 months ago. It was a car accident on Interstate 77 during that terrible ice storm we had in February. They were driving back from visiting your father's sister in Columbus when they hit a patch of black ice." The world seemed to tilt sideways. I gripped Frank's hand so tightly I probably hurt him, but I needed something solid to anchor me to reality. "They're dead," I whispered. "Both of them." Mrs. Patterson nodded sadly. "I'm so sorry, honey. I assumed someone had contacted you. The funeral was beautiful. Everyone from the neighborhood came. We all wondered why you weren't there, but nobody wanted to pry." "I didn't know," I said numbly. "We haven't spoken in 3 years. Nobody called me." "Oh, sweetheart," Mrs. Patterson said, tears in her eyes. "Your parents mentioned the estrangement to a few people, but I think everyone assumed you'd been notified through other family members. Your father's sister Helen organized everything, and she might not have had your current contact information." I thought about the package sitting on our kitchen table in Denver, wrapped in silver paper with a white ribbon supposedly sent by parents who had been dead for 8 months. The cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. Someone had known about my parents' death and used it to torment me, to dangle the hope of reconciliation in front of me like a cruel joke. Mrs. Patterson continued talking, sharing memories of Robert and Dorothy, but I could barely process her words. All I could think about was the last conversation I'd had with my mother, the angry words and hurt feelings that would never be resolved now. I'd spent 3 years hoping they would reach out, that we could find a way back to each other, and now I knew that possibility had been taken away 8 months ago. "The house has been empty since the estate was settled," Mrs. Patterson explained. "Helen put it on the market, but it hasn't sold yet. The real estate company checks on it once a month, but otherwise it just sits there." Frank asked the question I couldn't voice. "Has anyone else been asking about Margaret's parents recently? Anyone claiming to be family or friends?" Mrs. Patterson thought for a moment. "Actually, yes. About a month ago, a young man came by asking questions about the family. He said he was a former student of Dorothy's who wanted to send condolences, but something about him seemed off. He was asking very specific questions about Margaret, whether she ever visited, what her relationship with her parents had been like. I didn't give him any information, but he seemed to know quite a bit already." My blood ran cold. "What did he look like?" "Tall, thin, maybe late 20s or early 30s. Dark hair, very intense eyes. He had this way of staring that made me uncomfortable. When I told him I couldn't help him, he got angry and said something about people getting what they deserve." Frank and I exchanged looks. The description sounded familiar, though I couldn't quite place it. "Did he give you a name?" Frank asked. "He said his name was David, but he didn't give a last name. He drove off in an old blue sedan when I told him to leave." We thanked Mrs. Patterson and walked back to our car in stunned silence. I felt like I was drowning in grief and confusion. Not only had I lost my parents without ever getting the chance to reconcile with them, but someone was actively using their deaths to psychologically torture me. During the long drive back to Denver, Frank and I tried to piece together what we knew. Someone named David had been asking questions about me in my hometown. The same person had likely been sending threatening letters to Frank's school and watching our house. And now they'd sent a package designed to exploit my deepest emotional wound, pretending it came from parents who had been dead for 8 months. "Frank," I said as we crossed the Colorado state line, "I think I know who David is." As the miles passed, the memory became clearer. 2 years ago, I'd had a student in my 4th grade class named David Clarence. He was a 28-year-old man taking education courses at the community college who needed to complete observation hours in an elementary classroom. What had started as a normal student-teacher arrangement had quickly become uncomfortable and then frightening. David's interest in my teaching methods had seemed genuine at first. He'd take detailed notes during lessons, ask thoughtful questions about classroom management, and volunteer to help with activities. But gradually his focus had shifted from general education practices to very personal questions about my life. He'd ask about my marriage, my family background, my hobbies outside of school. When I redirected conversations back to educational topics, he'd become sullen and argumentative. The turning point came when I found David going through my desk after hours. He'd stayed late, claiming he needed to finish paperwork, but when I returned to get something, I'd forgotten I caught him reading through my personal files. He'd photographed pages from my gradebook that included students' home addresses and parent contact information. When I confronted him, he became aggressive, claiming he was just trying to understand my organizational system. I'd reported the incident to Principal Martinez immediately. The investigation revealed that David had been asking other teachers inappropriate questions about me, requesting my schedule and home address under various pretenses. One teacher had caught him trying to access my employee file in the main office. Another had noticed him following me to my car after work on several occasions. David's community college supervisor was horrified when Principal Martinez contacted her. Apparently, David had been removed from 2 previous placements for similar boundary violations with female teachers. The pattern was always the same: excessive interest in personal details, attempts to access private information, and increasingly inappropriate behavior when redirected. The final incident occurred when David showed up at our house one evening claiming he needed to discuss a classroom project. Frank had answered the door and immediately sensed something was wrong. David's excuse for the visit made no sense, and he kept trying to look past Frank into our home, asking questions about our living situation and whether we had security systems. Frank had firmly but politely turned David away, but not before David made several disturbing comments. He'd said things like, "Margaret doesn't realize how good she has it, and some people don't appreciate what they have until it's gone." When Frank mentioned the visit to me the next day, I'd immediately contacted Principal Martinez and the college supervisor. David was expelled from the education program and banned from all local school districts. The college supervisor assured us that he'd never be allowed to work with children in any capacity. We'd thought that was the end of it, but apparently David's obsession with me had continued to grow during the 2 years since his expulsion. He knows everything about our lives because he's been watching us for months, maybe years, I told Frank as we pulled into our driveway. He knew about my parents' deaths because he'd been researching my background. He probably found the newspaper obituary and realized he could use their deaths to hurt me. Frank's jaw was clenched with anger. This isn't just stalking Margaret. This is elaborate psychological warfare. He's been planning this for a long time, gathering information and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. We sat in our car for a moment, staring at our house, knowing that package was still sitting on our kitchen table. The home that had always been our safe haven now felt violated and unsafe. David had been watching us here, learning our routines, studying our lives like some sick research project. "We're calling the police right now," Frank said firmly. "This has gone way beyond pranks or harassment. That package could contain something dangerous, and David's behavior shows he's escalating. I nodded, though part of me felt embarrassed about not recognizing the threat sooner. All the signs had been there, the wrong number, calls, the feeling of being watched. Frank's growing protective instincts. I dismissed them as paranoia, but Frank's subconscious had been picking up on real danger signals. We called 911 from our car, and within 20 minutes, 2 patrol officers arrived at our house. Officer Martinez and Officer Johnson listened to our story with growing concern, taking detailed notes about David's history, the threatening letters, and the suspicious package. "Ma'am, you did the right thing calling us," Officer Martinez said. "This sounds like a textbook stalking case with some very concerning escalation. We're going to need to call in the bomb squad to examine that package safely." The next few hours were surreal. Our quiet suburban street filled with police cars, a bomb squad truck, and curious neighbors watching from their yards. Frank and I waited across the street while specialists in protective gear carefully examined the package that had caused me so much emotional turmoil. Finally, Sergeant Williams from the bomb squad approached us with a grim expression. "The package contains live insects specifically chosen for their psychological impact rather than physical danger. There are also photographs and personal items that suggest extensive surveillance of your daily activities." I felt sick. Not only had David violated our privacy for months, but he'd crafted this package specifically to traumatize me emotionally. The insects were probably chosen because he'd observed my fear of creepy crawlies during his time in my classroom. Every detail was calculated to cause maximum psychological damage. "We found fingerprints on the inner packaging that will run through the system," Sergeant Williams continued. "And the photographs show this person has been watching your home and workplace for an extended period. This isn't a prank, it's a serious crime." Within hours, the fingerprints came back with a match David Clarence with a record of harassment and stalking charges involving 3 other women since his expulsion from the education program. Police immediately obtained a warrant for his arrest and search of his apartment. The search of David's apartment revealed the full scope of his obsession with me and our lives. Detective Sarah Coleman, who specialized in stalking cases, called us the next morning to describe what they'd found. I sat in our living room, Frank's arm around me, as she detailed the disturbing evidence that had been carefully organized in David's 1-bedroom apartment. "He had an entire wall dedicated to photographs of you two," Detective Coleman explained, her voice gentle but serious. "Pictures taken with a telephoto lens of you leaving for work, grocery shopping, walking in your neighborhood. He'd been documenting your routines for at least 6 months, maybe longer." The violation, I felt, was overwhelming. David had been a shadow in our lives, watching our most mundane moments and recording them like some twisted documentary. Every private kiss goodbye in our driveway, every Saturday morning, coffee on our front porch, every evening walk through the neighborhood, had been observed and cataloged by someone whose intentions were purely malicious. "We also found detailed journals," Detective Coleman continued. "Pages and pages of observations about your daily habits, your work schedule, your relationship with Frank. He'd somehow obtained your parents' death certificates and newspaper obituaries, and he'd been planning this birthday package for months." Frank's hand tightened on mine. What exactly was he planning to do after she opened the package? Based on his journal entries, the package was just the beginning, Detective Coleman said grimly. He'd planned a series of increasingly disturbing gifts, each designed to break down Margaret's emotional defenses. The insects were meant to trigger a phobia response, but future packages would have contained more threatening items. I couldn't stop shaking as I processed this information. David hadn't just wanted to scare me once. He'd planned an extended campaign of psychological torture. The birthday package was designed to be the opening move in a chess game where my mental health was the prize he was trying to destroy. He'd also researched your family extensively, Detective Coleman added. He knew about your estrangement from your parents, and his journal entries show he believed you deserved to be punished for marrying beneath your social class. In his mind, he was carrying out some kind of justice by using your parents' deaths against you. The twisted logic made me feel nauseous. David had appointed himself judge and jury of my life choices, deciding that I needed to be punished for falling in love with Frank. The fact that my parents were dead had made me a perfect target in his mind because he could exploit my grief and unresolved family relationships without fear of interference. "Where is he now?" Frank asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We arrested him at his apartment this morning," Detective Coleman replied. "He's been charged with stalking, harassment, criminal threat, and several other felonies. His bail has been set extremely high because the judge considers him a flight risk and a continued danger to you both." Over the next few weeks, as the legal process unfolded, we learned more disturbing details about David's background. After his expulsion from the education program, he'd worked a series of temporary jobs, while apparently spending most of his time and energy stalking me. He'd been fired from 3 different positions for inappropriate behavior toward female coworkers, always following the same pattern of excessive personal interest and boundary violations. The prosecuting attorney, Linda Rodriguez, met with us to prepare for David's trial. She explained that David's case was particularly strong because of the extensive documentation he'd kept of his own criminal behavior. His journals weren't just evidence of stalking. They were essentially a confession to months of planned psychological warfare. "The good news is that his own writings make prosecution straightforward," Attorney Rodriguez explained. "The bad news is that they also reveal the depth of his obsession and the level of planning involved. This wasn't impulsive behavior. It was a calculated campaign designed to destroy your sense of safety and emotional well-being." Frank asked the question that had been haunting both of us. "Is he likely to try something like this again when he gets out of prison?" "That's why we're pushing for the maximum sentence," Attorney Rodriguez replied. "With his history of escalating behavior and the extensive evidence of planning, we're confident we can get him significant prison time. We're also going to recommend mandatory psychological evaluation and treatment." The trial itself was emotionally devastating but also empowering. Sitting in that courtroom listening to evidence of how David had violated our privacy and planned to terrorize me, I felt the full weight of what Frank's intuition had saved me from. If he hadn't noticed something wrong with that package, I would have opened it on my birthday morning alone in our kitchen and experienced exactly the psychological trauma David had so carefully orchestrated. David showed no remorse during the trial. Even when confronted with his own journal entries describing his plans to break down Margaret's defenses and teach her the consequences of her choices, he maintained that he'd done nothing wrong. In his twisted worldview, I deserved punishment for rejecting my parents' values and marrying Frank. The jury took less than 3 hours to convict David on all charges. Judge Thompson sentenced him to 8 years in prison, noting that the extensive planning and psychological nature of his crimes made him particularly dangerous. "Mr. Clarence," the judge said during sentencing, "you turned this woman's family tragedy into a weapon against her. That level of calculated cruelty deserves the full punishment the law allows." As we left the courthouse that day, I felt a mixture of relief and residual fear. David would be in prison for years, but I knew I'd never completely forget the feeling of being watched and hunted. The experience had changed something fundamental about how I moved through the world, making me more aware of my surroundings and more grateful for Frank's protective instincts. In the months following David's sentencing, Frank and I had to rebuild our sense of safety and privacy. We installed a comprehensive security system, changed our phone numbers, and even considered moving to a different house. But eventually, we decided that running away would let David win, even from prison. This was our home, and we weren't going to let his sick obsession drive us away from the life we'd built together. The hardest part wasn't the practical security measures. It was processing the emotional trauma of what David had attempted to do. I started seeing a therapist doctor, Rebecca Martinez, who specialized in helping stalking victims recover their sense of agency and safety. Through our sessions, I began to understand how David had specifically targeted my deepest vulnerabilities. "He studied you like a predator studies prey," Dr. Martinez explained during one of our sessions. "He identified your estrangement from your parents as your emotional weak point and crafted his attack to cause maximum psychological damage." The fact that he waited until your birthday made it even more cruel. Working through my feelings about the fake package helped me process grief I'd been avoiding about my parents' actual deaths. For 3 years, I'd held on to anger about their rejection of Frank and their absence from our wedding. Learning they'd died while we were still estranged added guilt and regret to that anger, creating a complex emotional knot that David had tried to exploit. Your parents made their choice to cut contact, Dr. Martinez reminded me gently. You can't control their decisions or change what happened between you, but you can choose how to honor their memory and move forward with your life. Frank also struggled with his own guilt about not acting sooner on his suspicions. He blamed himself for not recognizing the threat earlier, for not protecting me from David's surveillance, for allowing the situation to escalate as far as it did. But Dr. Martinez helped him understand that his instincts had actually saved me from exactly what David intended. Frank, your subconscious picked up on danger signals that Margaret couldn't see because she was emotionally invested in believing the package was real, Dr. Martinez explained during a joint session. Your protective response prevented Margaret from experiencing the full psychological trauma David had planned. Gradually, I began to appreciate just how much Frank's love had protected me. His immediate suspicious reaction to the package hadn't been paranoia. It had been the response of someone who knew me so well that he could sense when something was wrong even before I could see it myself. David had spent months studying my habits and vulnerabilities, but Frank had spent years learning to read my emotions and protect my well-being. The experience also taught me to trust Frank's instincts in ways I never had before. When he expressed concern about a new neighbor who seemed too interested in our comings and goings, I listened instead of dismissing his worries. When he suggested we vary our routines and avoid predictable patterns, I agreed rather than arguing that he was being overly cautious. 6 months after David's conviction, I received a letter from the prison where he was serving his sentence. For a moment, my heart stopped thinking David had found a way to contact me directly. But the letter was from a victim's advocate who explained that David was required to participate in psychological counseling as part of his sentence, and he'd expressed interest in writing me an apology letter. Absolutely not, Frank said immediately when I told him about the request. He's already done enough damage. He doesn't get to manipulate you further with fake apologies. I agreed completely. David had proven that he viewed our relationship in terms of power and control, and allowing him to contact me would just give him another opportunity to try to manipulate my emotions. The best revenge was refusing to engage with his attempts to remain relevant in my life. Instead, I channeled my experience into helping other stalking victims through a local support organization. Talking to women who'd endured similar violations helped me understand that David's behavior followed predictable patterns. Stalkers often target their victims' deepest insecurities and use personal information as weapons. They count on their victims' shame and isolation to prevent them from seeking help. The most important thing to remember, I tell new support group members, is that none of this is your fault. You didn't do anything to deserve being hunted and terrorized. And trusting the people who love you isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Through my volunteer work, I met Detective Coleman again when she came to speak to our support group about recognizing stalking behaviors and working with law enforcement. She told me that David's case had become a training example for other officers because of how well documented his planning had been. Your husband's immediate recognition that something was wrong probably saved you from months or years of escalating harassment, Detective Coleman told the group. Sometimes the people who love us can see dangers we can't, and listening to them isn't paranoia, it's survival. Frank began volunteering with the organization too, speaking to partners and family members of stalking victims about recognizing warning signs and supporting their loved ones through recovery. His perspective was valuable because he'd experienced the helplessness of knowing someone he loved was in danger, but not being able to fully explain why he was concerned. Trust your instincts, Frank would tell worried husbands and boyfriends. If something feels wrong, even if you can't articulate exactly what it is, speak up. The people who love us deserve our protection even when they don't understand why we're worried. A year after David's conviction, Frank and I decided we were ready to start the family we'd been planning before David's intrusion into our lives. I was pregnant with our first child when I received word that David had been denied parole and would serve his full 8-year sentence. The timing felt symbolic, like we were finally free to build the future he'd tried to destroy. Our daughter Emma was born on a snowy December morning, and holding her in our hospital room, I thought about how different my life might have been if Frank hadn't trusted his instincts about that package. David's plan hadn't just been about terrorizing me, it had been about isolating me from the people who loved me and destroying my ability to trust my own judgment. "She's never going to doubt that she's loved and protected," Frank whispered, stroking Emma's tiny hand. "And she's going to learn to trust her instincts and the people who care about her." Watching Frank with our daughter, I saw the same protective awareness that had saved me from David's psychological trap. Not the paranoid hypervigilance of someone who sees threats everywhere, but the calm, steady attention of someone who takes responsibility for protecting what matters most. Emma is 3 years old now, and Frank and I have found our way to a new normal. We're careful about our privacy and security in ways we never were before David, but we're not prisoners in our own lives. We've learned to balance reasonable caution with the freedom to live openly and joyfully. I still think about my parents sometimes, especially when Emma does something that reminds me of my own childhood. I wish Robert and Dorothy could have met their granddaughter, could have seen how wrong they were about Frank's character and worthiness. But I've made peace with the fact that some relationships end badly, and sometimes the people we love make choices that hurt us deeply. The fake birthday package that David sent me was meant to weaponize my grief and unresolved family relationships. Instead, it taught me that real love isn't about perfect families or happy endings. It's about people who pay attention to each other, who trust each other's instincts, and who protect each other from harm, even when the danger isn't immediately obvious. Frank never says, "I told you so," about recognizing the threat in that package, but sometimes I catch him watching me with the same intense attention he showed that morning. It's not suspicion or paranoia. It's love expressed through vigilance, the kind of deep caring that notices when something is wrong even before the person being protected can see it themselves. "How did you know?" I asked him recently as we watched Emma play in our backyard. "What exactly did you see that made you so certain the package was dangerous?" Frank was quiet for a moment, thinking. "It wasn't any one thing," he finally said. "It was that the package was trying too hard to be exactly what you would want it to be. Real gifts from real people have imperfections, little signs of genuine human emotion. That package felt like someone's idea of what your mother would send, but not like something she actually would send." That explanation made perfect sense to me now. David had studied my relationship with Dorothy well enough to create a convincing imitation, but he couldn't replicate the authentic emotional complexity of a real family relationship. His package was like a photograph that's been retouched too much. Technically perfect, but somehow lifeless and false. The experience taught me to pay attention to those subtle wrongnesses that Frank noticed immediately. Not every threat announces itself obviously. Sometimes danger comes wrapped in exactly what we most want to believe. The most effective lies are the ones that tell us what we desperately hope is true. "I love you for protecting me," I told Frank, "but I love you even more for teaching me to protect myself." Now, when I speak to support groups for stalking victims, I always end with the same message. Trust the people who love you enough to tell you uncomfortable truths. Listen when they express concerns you don't understand. Sometimes the most dangerous gifts come wrapped in our deepest desires, but love and vigilance can protect us from those who would exploit our vulnerabilities. And if you're watching this story wondering whether you should trust your own instincts about someone who's making you uncomfortable, please don't ignore those feelings. Your subconscious might be picking up on warning signs your conscious mind hasn't processed yet. The people who love you like Frank loved me can often see dangers you can't because they're not blinded by hope or wishful thinking. What experiences have you had with trusting your instincts about people or situations? Have you ever had someone in your life whose protective concerns saved you from making a dangerous mistake? Please share your stories in the comments below. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and subscribe for more real-life stories about the power of love and intuition to protect us from harm. And please share this video with anyone who might need to hear this message about trusting the people who truly care about them. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the greatest gift isn't what comes in a beautiful package, but the wisdom to recognize when something beautiful is actually dangerous. Stay safe. Trust your loved ones, and never underestimate the power of genuine care to protect you from those who would do you harm.